JavaScript. It's basically JavaScript with some extra features. Not too hard to learn if you know JavaScript though. And in general, by the way, TypeScript is something which is definitely worth learning, even if you're not using Angular. But it is something I want to mention here. In React's case, we have a totally different syntax though. There, you don't really have a HTML JavaScript separation. Instead, everything is JavaScript. A component indeed is just a JavaScript function. And you have a feature which is called JSX, which is a special syntax you can use in your JavaScript code to basically describe to React which HTML content it should eventually render in the real DOM based upon certain conditions and so on. So you have a mixture of HTML and JavaScript in React. For Angular and Vue, you have a stricter separation and you're a bit closer to vanilla HTML and JavaScript there, especially in Vue. So now that we had a brief look at the philosophies and the syntax, how easy is it to get started with those frameworks and to learn them? Well, I would argue for Angular, you have quite a steep learning curve. You have quite a steep learning curve because you need a more complex project setup. You can't just start writing Angular code in any web project, but because you use TypeScript and because a couple of optimization steps are required, you need to create a new project with a special setup. Now, there is the Angular CLI, which makes that easier. It's an official tool you can use to create those projects. So the project creation is not difficult, but it can be strange to a newcomer that you suddenly need to do that you can't just add an import to your web page and you're good to go. That's not how Angular works. In addition, you need to learn TypeScript if you don't know it already. It's not too hard, but it is definitely something new to learn. And you need to learn the overall Angular way of thinking and the Angular syntax. On the pro side, however, you have that split between HTML and TypeScript, so you don't have to learn a new mixture syntax, but you just have to learn some special instructions you add to HTML, and otherwise you work with default HTML and roughly with default JavaScript, plus that TypeScript part as well. For React, I would also argue it has a rather steep learning curve, maybe a bit less steep initially because it is JavaScript, and you don't need a complex setup, though realistically you do need it. If you want to use that JSX syntax which it introduces, you need a more complex setup as well, but you also do have a tool for creating those setups, just as it was the case with Angular. But what's a bit easier is that you use regular JavaScript. You have that JSX thing, so that mixture of HTML and JavaScript all in one file, which is definitely strange when you work with it the first time, because you're not used to that from vanilla JavaScript development before. But you can get into that. You do, however, also have to learn to think in this React-ish way, and you have to get used to this merging of JavaScript and HTML. Which is why I would argue that learning React is also not super easy and roughly on the same level as Angular, but of course it's always different for different people. For Vue, I would argue that most people agree that it's rather easy to learn, that it has a rather flat and linear learning curve. You do have that because a complex setup is not always required. For bigger Vue projects where you want to use advanced features, you do need one, and you have the Vue CLI, the command line interface, for creating those projects. But unlike for Angular and React, for a Vue, you don't always need such a complex setup. You can get started with Vue by just adding an import to a HTML file, and you can start writing some code and see awesome results. That's pretty neat. It also uses JavaScript. You can use TypeScript if you want. By the way, you can also use TypeScript with React if you want, but you don't have to. And unlike React, Vue also doesn't have this special JSX syntax. It instead also splits HTML and JavaScript, and therefore I would argue Vue overall is rather easy to get into. What about performance then? Does easy to learn also mean that it's bad, that it has a bad performance because it's too simple? No. But first of all, we have to differentiate. There is startup performance and runtime performance. Startup performance simply means how fast does the web app load if a user visits the page? How quickly does it become interactive, and when is the user able to use it? This is primarily influenced by the initial bundle size, so by the size of code that needs to be downloaded. That, of course, includes your code, but also the core framework code. And when we're talking about startup performance and about bundle sizes, a common mistake is to simply create a bunch of Hello World apps for the different frameworks and then build them for production and compare the created bundle sizes. And I'm not a fan of that, because typically you don't build Hello World apps. And I could build a framework that's optimized for Hello World apps and gives you a super small bundle there, but which is awful at bigger apps.